This is Focus with Jack Caudill.
Good evening, I'm Jack Caudill. Welcome to this month's edition of Focus. This month we're talking about child abuse. April is Child Abuse Prevention Month. 3 guests with us to talk about that. Carrie Sanderson is the director of the Center for the Prevention of Child Maltreatment. Kahala Two Bulls is the executive director of the 7th Circuit CASA Program, and Tracey Decker, deputy state's attorney with the Pennington County State's Attorney's Office. A little couple notes here before we get going. The CDC says at least 1 in 7 children have experienced child abuse and or neglect in the past year. They say that is likely an underestimate. They say that in 2019, 1,840 children across the country died of abuse and neglect in the United States. They say the rates of child abuse and neglect are 5 times higher for children in families with low socioeconomic status. Tracey Decker is going to join us first here. Thank you for coming up. When it comes to child abuse, when does it move to the point that law enforcement becomes involved in this?
That can be a tough question sometimes. In South Dakota, there's mandatory reporting laws, so anybody that takes care of children, teachers, doctors, counselors, are required to report to either law enforcement or DSS if they suspect abuse. So that can get police officers involved often. But then for police, they have to decide if there's probable cause to believe a crime has been committed before an arrest takes place or before it gets referred to our office. And that can be a little tougher call to make.
How much child abuse do we see in this area, and what kind of things do you guys see and that the state's attorney's office deals with?
Probably the most common thing the state's attorney's office deals with is abuse against very young children that have a hard time telling anybody about it, infants, toddlers, and we see a lot of grabbing type bruises or broken bones and old healed broken bones once they're examined. That's probably what we see the most of in our office.
Now, when you look at those kind of grabbing things, how do you draw the line between what people would consider just regular discipline of kids and to the point where it crosses that line and becomes abuse of kids?
That can be a really hard line to determine, and it just depends on a lot of factors. There's no one thing we look at. It's kind of case by case. Experienced attorneys in our office will get together and discuss the case, and we talk about everything from how did the bruising occur, what was used, how old is the child, what was the child doing that got that kind of reaction from the caregiver. What's the caregiver's history? You know, there's just a whole lot of things we look at before we decide if something like a grabbing bruise or a bruise on a child's leg might rise to the level of abuse.
Are you seeing these more often? You mentioned caregivers. Does this happen more often with caregivers, with parents, with other relatives, friends? Where is this coming from as a rule?
I say caregivers because that's usually who it is, but I think what would surprise people is most often in our office we see a lot of women. And it's usually the mother of the child, but it can be the live-in boyfriend or the stepdad or the father as well. But I just think people would be surprised at the number of females that we see that abuse their children. And I use abuse loosely because sometimes it's one instance and sometimes it's a series and pattern of instances.
Most people don't really have any connection with child abuse. They don't see it. They don't know about it. How much more of this is going on than most people realize is in the community?
I think a lot more than, as you mentioned, the CDC statistic, and from my experience, that's also underreported because kids don't, either they're too young to talk about it, or they love their abuser, they love their parent or their caregiver, and they want to take care of them. They don't want to get them in trouble. And so it's not talked about. And so it takes somebody like a teacher or a counselor or a neighbor or somebody that sees something to say something to get authorities involved. And that doesn't always happen. I mean, people don't want to get involved a lot of times. So
how difficult is it? How do you get people to speak out? How do you get people to be involved in something like this?
Well, I think this is a good thing, just letting people know that it's out there, that it's in the community, and that there are resources that can help. You know, pointing people towards resources like CASA and letting them know how to get a hold of DSS, or letting them know that law enforcement will take it seriously no matter how small that person thinks it is. Because I think sometimes people hesitate to call because they don't want to bother somebody and they think maybe it's not a big deal. And I would just tell people they should trust their instincts and get involved.
Is there a stereotype of who a child abuser is? Is there a set pattern of who those people are? Is it from good families, bad families? Is it come from all aspects of society that you may not expect it to come from?
I would say in my experience over the last couple of decades is that it's everybody and anybody. I think in terms when you're talking about abuse, there's no good family or bad family because it can come from all over. A lot of times I do see it more from lower socioeconomic families, but I don't think that's because of their economic status. I think it's because they have fewer resources. They may live closer to their neighbors, so they just may have more people that are just generally involved with them to notice, but it definitely happens across the board.
Now, when you talk about these child abuse cases, you prosecuted those, you said, for about 15 years. How difficult and how emotional does that get, and how much does that wear on people that you're dealing with this day in, day out, month after month?
It's terribly emotionally exhausting because you have to try to form somewhat of a bond with the abused child if they're old enough to. And so you get to know them and you understand how much they're hurt and how scared they are to stand up to their abuser. And I've had children over the years that have had to testify and confront their abusers, and it's heart-wrenching for that child, even for the abuser, because on some level they love the child. It's tough on jurors. I would say it's tough on everybody throughout the system to have to deal with this crime.
Now, you guys are prosecuting the perpetrators in these, but what's being done to help the kids through this process? Because it's very difficult on them, you said, having to relive all of this stuff again.
Yep. We always encourage whoever is the caregiver for the abused child at the time they're going through the system, whether it's a foster parent or another relative, to get the child involved in counseling. And we help them do that. We have a really robust victim advocacy program that refers people to age-appropriate counselors or psychiatrists or whatever level of care the child might need in the area, because really processing that with somebody who knows how and somebody who's not emotionally attached is the best way to help the child get through the pain.
Now, if either a child or an adult or somebody has a child abuse case that they need to be dealt with, where do they turn to? Where do they go?
You mean in terms of getting
in terms of getting help? Well,
I would encourage anybody who's in an abusive relationship or sees their child being abused to either call 911 if you have to, or call 394-4131 or 4134, both of which are Rapid City Police Department non-emergency numbers. Because if the police department doesn't help on a criminal level, they also certainly have resources that they can point people in the community to.
Almost out of time here. Has the pandemic changed the number of cases that are coming through your Office of Child Abuse?
I looked at that before I came here, and I would say a little bit. Our numbers were down a little bit during 2020, but we're starting to see the numbers we would typically anticipate in a year again.
All right, Tracey Decker, I want to thank you for coming up. We're out of time. Okay. We'll continue our look at child abuse when we continue with this month's edition of Focus. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus. Again, we are talking about Child Abuse Prevention Month, which is what April is, and Kahala Two Bulls is with us now. She is the Executive Director of the 7th Circuit CASA Program. Thank you for coming up. CASA, of course, stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates. First of all, what exactly is CASA and what does the organization do?
Absolutely. So we're a volunteer-based program. We have a small staff. We have a larger group of volunteers, and those volunteers are recruited, trained, and supported to be child advocates. We function in the court system and are assigned by judges to children in state custody because of abuse and neglect. So basically the idea is that foster system is scary. The foster system is isolating, and it's important for children to have safe, stable adults who move with them through the system, regardless of placement or the point in the proceedings that their case is at. So these CASA advocates meet with children regularly, gather information, share that with the court, but also build a relationship of trust and caring with the children that they advocate for.
How much of a need is there for that out this way?
Well, unfortunately, Pennington County has a really large volume of children in custody because of abuse and neglect. Oftentimes, Pennington County has the most children in custody of any county in South Dakota, not adjusted for population, but just straight across numbers. So right now, our program covers Pennington, Fall River, and Custer County, and there are 443 kids in state custody.
So what kind of situations are these kids dealing with? What kind of situations brought these kids in, and what kind of court proceedings are you guys involved with them?
Absolutely. So these are civil cases where children are found to be unsafe in their home environment. They could be with parents, relatives, caretakers. That environment is determined to be unsafe, and children are brought into state custody. The majority of those cases, neglect is what's established at home. Some of them are physical abuse, some of them are sexual abuse, but the vast majority are neglect cases. And just like every family, all these cases are unique. There's a lot of challenges, and probably one of the biggest commonalities we find is that the adults at home are struggling with addiction, and that creates an unsafe environment for the children that they're caring for.
Now, you talk about your main source of work out here is from volunteers. Who are these volunteers and where are they coming from?
Our volunteers are amazing. They come from all over the place. So we have elderly volunteers who are retired and looking for a way to spend their time and contribute to the community. And we have volunteers who are just waiting to turn 21 so that they can sign up and be part of our program. They do have to be 21 years of age, and they have to pass a battery of background checks because, of course, safety is our priority and our promise to children. Then we do a 30-hour training, and we really get them well-versed on child development, the court system, and their network of support as a volunteer.
And as far as all of that training goes, what all kind of things are they doing? Is this one-on-one training? Is this group training? How do you get people up to speed and ready to go for something like this?
Great question. We try to use as many modalities as we can, but we're part of the National CASA Association, and we have an initial 30-hour training that gets volunteers to the point where they can be sworn in as officers of the court. And that is a group class. And right now we're offering that via Zoom and an online learning classroom so that we can do it remotely and not have any COVID concerns. When that resolves, then we'll go back to an in-person classroom.
Now, you talk about the COVID concerns. The pandemic has changed everything around the world through all of this. What kind of challenges is this presented for CASA in the work you guys are doing through all of this?
Like I said, our program is based on volunteer relationships with children. So of course, we've had to really compensate for all the ways that we can keep both our volunteers and the children we work with, who oftentimes are medically fragile in some manner because of the environments that they've been born into or grown up in. There may be higher risk factors for respiratory disease, things like that. So we really had to look at what the impact we wanted to have was, and safety is our priority. So we've had to find a lot of creative different ways of connecting over the last year, and creative ways of training and bringing on new volunteers as well.
And looking at that, these can be very emotional cases anytime you're dealing with children, especially when you're dealing with kids in these kind of situations. How do you separate that emotion from the work that you're trying to do with the kids, or can you separate that?
I don't think that we can separate, our concern and our caring, but what we do is we educate a lot about the best outcomes for children, and we try to honor the families that children come from and honor that if at all possible, we know from an enormous amount of study that children are best in their home environment. So we want to support health in that home environment, and we want to believe in safety, and we want to build skills so that that can be a safe and stable relationship for children.
Now, you guys are set out to help the kids, but what are the volunteers getting out of this work?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of people come in focused on what they're going to do for others and then find an enormous amount of growth and inspiration for themselves in the program, because it really becomes, it shifts from being that obligation of fulfilling one's duty to that reward of getting to see children and families that you really care about, you really do love, grow and become their own individuals. And it's an exciting thing. And we also, as a staff, really love building those relationships with our volunteers.
Do those relationships sometimes continue after the legal situation is wrapped up and done?
Oh, absolutely. We have volunteers who still have, contact with the children that they've advocated for years to come. We even have a board member who was a CASA child himself and now serves the community and really supports our agency that way. So we really like to keep that continuum going because it is a way of building relationship, just like a family or a neighborhood. We're all part of a community together. And I think that's what child abuse prevention is about seeing those risk factors in the community and responding compassionately.
Now, as you look at this, you said earlier that you have far more kids than you have volunteers, in need of more volunteers. If somebody wants to be a volunteer, what do they do? How do they get involved in this?
Well, if somebody wants to be a volunteer, they should feel free to reach out. It's not an immediate commitment. It's a conversation at first. Our website is casaofrapidcity.org. We also have an active Facebook that has all of our trainings for the rest of the year. People can go on, they can reach out to our office and ask any questions, and it really is not like I said, it's not a commitment, it's just a conversation, and people may find that they want to be a volunteer, or they might find that there's some other way that they fit into the puzzle piece of how we become a healthy community.
Is there a phone number they can call if they want to get a hold of you?
Absolutely, 605-394-2203.
All right, Kahala Two Bulls, thank you very much for coming up. We'll continue our look at Child Abuse Prevention Month when we return with this month's edition of Focus. And good evening, I'm Jack Caudill. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus, talking about child abuse this month. This April is National Child Abuse Prevention Month. Carrie Sanderson is with us now. She's the director of the Center for Prevention of Child Maltreatment. Thank you for coming up and joining us. Your organization has been around since 2017. How did this group come to be?
Well, from 2014 to 2017, the South Dakota legislature funded a summer study to study child sexual abuse in our state. The outcome of that summer study was actually a strategic plan for how we can impact all child maltreatment across the state of South Dakota. Then Governor Dugard approved the funding for the Center for the Prevention of Child Maltreatment, and we opened our doors in 2017. So our mission is to work together across the state to end all forms of child maltreatment in an effort to build resilient families.
So what do you guys do? What are you doing to make that happen?
Our big picture goal is to unite the bodies of work that are happening across our state so that we can all be working towards better data collection and utilizing that data to make better informed decisions. We hope to look at the civil and criminal justice aspects of how we're handling abuse, neglect, and maltreatment in South Dakota, how we can better help a victim through the criminal and civil justice process, as well as help our community respond when there are bad things that are happening. And importantly, we want to educate our professionals on the best way to respond to when something bad happens in your community or within your home, and how to find those resources. So we're building the infrastructure to create the unified vision of health and wellness for our kiddos, and then of course ending child maltreatment in our state.
Now, you're talking about making sure you have accurate data collection as you collect that data and look at all of that. How bad is the problem of child abuse here in South Dakota?
That is an excellent question, because we don't actually know. We have great rich access to data in certain industries and in certain departments, but unfortunately that data doesn't talk to each other. And because of that, we don't have an overall view of wellness for our kiddos. But what we do know is that the Department of Social Services on a statewide level receives approximately 16,000 calls for abuse and neglect across the state. We also know that there's a great level of harm occurring, and that data is captured by our Division of Criminal Investigation. And importantly, our research, our neurobiology tells us that child maltreatment and child abuse at times is something that happens behind closed doors and at home, or in a way where you can't tell. So many children and many adults do not tell about the harm that's happened to them. So we have an idea that this is something we have to address, but we don't know the exact number.
Now, at the beginning of the show, we talked about the CDC and their numbers and said they believe it's a big underestimate as to how much is going on. Yes. How much of a challenge is it to get people to acknowledge what's going on and to speak out about what's going on?
It is very tough. Child maltreatment, child sexual abuse, child abuse in general is something that we as a society don't want to talk about. We don't want to acknowledge that it's happening in our home or in our neighbors' homes or at, in different organizations. And as a result of that, there's a stigma to not talk about bad things happening. But I want to challenge that. I want us as South Dakotans to come together and unite in a way that we can report problems in a way that we can provide resources for families, help those children and those families stay together, and provide resiliency for communities and families.
As you look at all of this, what kind of myths maybe are there about child abuse? What do people not understand about it that they should understand, or think about it that isn't true?
I'd like to introduce you to a term called adverse childhood experiences. When bad things happen in child, such as an adversity, we know that those adversities can have lifelong impacts. Why this is essential for us to know is because if we want to address societal issues such as human trafficking or overcrowding of prisons or potentially too many people coming to our emergency rooms, we need to recognize that when bad things happen in childhood, they have lifelong impacts. And so what we would like to tell people in the midst to overcome is that adversity happens across the board. It has no socioeconomic boundary. It has no zip code. And if we can all acknowledge how important it is to know about adverse childhood experiences, receive training on that, incorporate it into your daily life, we all can make a difference.
So as you look at those challenges, what kind of resources are out there? If you get people to acknowledge it and come forward, what kind of resources are there out there that they can turn to?
South Dakota is doing some neat things. First of all, access 211, the 211 helpline, which is now available statewide, will allow you to find the resources that are actually in your community, or if they're not in your community, you can find out where the closest resource is. Next, I'd encourage you to look into adverse childhood experience training or enough sexual abuse training. Both of those programs are offered by Children's Home Society out here in the Rapid City area. You've got a strong Children's Home Society. Contact that organization to schedule those trainings today. And finally, just know that there is help for you. Know that there are resources for you, whether you're an adult or a child. There are ways for you to access services. Again, utilize that 211 helpline.
So what resources are available for kids to help kids through this process that have been through some awful, awful things, to help them move forward now?
What we're finding is that the most important thing that we can do as adults, as community members, is to recognize that it's not necessarily about why that child is acting the way they're acting, but what happened to that child. So changing the conversation from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And when we do that, we'll be able to connect that child to appropriate resources. So if you are a child, adolescent age, high school age, if you are struggling with housing insecurity, food insecurity, or you're just not feeling mentally well, know that you can always text the 211 helpline. That's the Text for Hope program. Additionally, if you are a parent, if you are a volunteer or somebody working in this line, know that you can find information out about adverse childhood experiences. We can connect you to multidisciplinary teams in your community that will have specific resources for your community, and also statewide resources that can go the gamut of giving education all the way back to telehealth services and mental health services for those children.
I got about 30 seconds left here with you. Do you feel like you're making progress? Do you feel like we're moving forward in getting the word out to people?
In the past 2.5 years, we've trained over 16,000 South Dakotans in ACEs. There is an online free mandatory reporter training from the Department of Social Services. Also, almost 15,000 South Dakotans have taken that. The answer is yes, we're ready for change. And if you want to know more, please visit us at www.sdcpcm.com.
Okay, what was that? You better repeat that one more time. That's a complicated one.
Yes, www.sdcpcm.com, the South Dakota Center for the Prevention of Child Maltreatment.
All right, Carrie Sanderson, thank you for coming up. Also want to thank Tracey Decker, Kahala Two Bulls. Thank you for joining us. See you again the first Sunday night of next month.